Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today we'll be looking at what successful onboarding looks like. We'll explore the importance of strategies that prioritize open communication, invest in relationship building, and bolster engagement during this critical period. If this is your first time at CTO Craft Bytes, let me tell you a little bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. Community members are over 5,000, and CTO Craft provides them with one-on-one coaching, mentoring groups, a curated Slack community, and events like this one. And a huge thank you to our headline partner, AWS, for helping make these bytes possible. So I'm Glyn Roberts, I'm emceeing today's session, and I'm the CTO of Digital Solutions at iTechArt. I'm very happy to introduce you to Vicky Willis, CTO at Zego. So thank you for being here, Vicky. Could you give us a short intro about yourself?
Of course. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along. As Lynn said, I'm Vicky. I'm the CTO at Zego. We're an insurtech operating in the commercial motor space. We're about 300 people at the moment, but we're growing rapidly following our Series C raise earlier in the year. We're best known for our innovative insurance products, especially in the gig economy space, which is where we started out. And we've since moved into products across the commercial motor space, focusing solely on self-employed drivers and also in fleets as well. And what we're really working to do is to take the knowledge we have of the industry and the access that we have to data, novel data sources in the industry, to improve our understanding of risk and give fundamentally better prices and products for people who are working using vehicles. As for me, my background's in software engineering. I started out as a back-end engineer and moved sort of slowly into more managerial roles, leading teams and structuring them, and sort of over to today being the CTO at Zego. I've got a particular interest in organizing and scaling teams and technologies as a company grows as well. I'm really excited to talk about onboarding, which is a really interesting and very important topic today.
Excellent. So great to have you, Vicky, here. I'm very much looking forward to this as well. So for the audience, anytime you can ask your questions from the Ask a Question link just below the video. And we will be tying those into my pre-prepared questions already that I've got lined up for today. So yeah, let's kick off and start talking about successfully onboarding. So Vicky, firstly, what is so important about onboarding?
The $1 million question. Why are we going to spend an hour talking about this? For me, onboarding is a really critical part of growing and building a team. And as technologists, we rely on people being able to apply their knowledge in a team setting, right? We're building technical products, we're building teams, and we're building against business priorities. So as leaders, we have a responsibility to create the right environment for people to thrive in that. And adding new people to a team is a really hard problem. Anything that involves people, I think, is a hard problem. You might be replacing somebody who held a previous role. The team has to get used to a new person. The new person has to get used to, how that role was done before. Or you might be adding a completely new role to a team as well, which can be quite tricky to navigate, especially if people are having to hand over responsibilities that they might have held before. So you've got this balancing act of the new person needs to learn as quickly as possible how to be effective, and you need to give them an environment to do that. And also the existing team needs to handle those dynamics changing. They need to learn how to work with a new role, a new person. And I suppose this is such a crucial area because bad onboarding can be incredibly disruptive to a team. Presumably, if you're hiring somebody, you're hiring them to be able to deliver on something, right? You're hiring a role that you need in the team. So, bad onboarding, I suppose, at the sort of less dramatic end of the scale, can mean that you don't get the true value of that person joining the team as quickly as you should. But at its very worst, bad onboarding can completely derail a team if people don't understand what that person's here to do or what they can expect. It can actually set a team back. So I think really focusing in on your onboarding processes, your philosophies, and how you want to welcome people to your team it's really a worthwhile investment.
Great. And you're touching on bad onboarding then. So what is normally the resulting output if the onboarding is incomplete or done incorrectly, or maybe some examples?
We sort of talked a little bit about, you're onboarding a role to deliver on an objective, right? So you can, set your delivery timelines back. If the onboarding doesn't go as smoothly as you'd hope, you won't be delivering what the business needs by not getting that person up to speed quickly enough. And as I said, like derailing the team is the absolute worst position. And I guess the most, from my experience, the most disruptive this gets is when the team are unclear on what to expect, especially if the role you're introducing is a leadership role. If people are trying to get used to working with a new leader or a completely new role in the team, if that sort of dynamic isn't set and people don't know what to expect, the team can't engage with the new person to help them on board, because onboarding isn't a solitary activity. It's not, and it isn't even just the manager and the person being onboarded, right? It's a whole team effort to bring somebody successfully into a business. So if people don't know what's expected, how are they supposed to help? They don't know what direction, they don't know what to hand over, they don't know what to help with. So usually teams just won't engage if they're not clear on that, is my experience, which obviously sets things back a lot. And sensitivities start to emerge as well if you haven't defined things properly, especially, as I said, if people are sort of trying to introduce leadership type roles. So people will make assumptions about what the role is. And usually, you know, if they're not clear, those assumptions will weight on the negative side as well. So, yeah, as I say, I think the result, if it's done badly, can be highly disruptive to maybe high performers you've already got in the team, as well as not getting the value that you've presumably invested a lot of effort into to hire somebody. Hiring's not easy, but that's another discussion. I won't go down that rabbit hole.
Sure. So it's not just the waste of the loss of productivity from the individual, it's the whole team can be impacted. So it's very exponential from that perspective. Okay. So yeah, let's talk about what does onboarding that's good look like for you?
Well, for me, I mean, the unhelpful answer is every role is different. So it depends, but there are some principles that I like to sort of follow with these things. And it starts, I've already gone on quite a lot about it, but it starts with the role definition. And that is defining really clearly what is expected from this person, when they start in the business, and communicating that both to the person and the team. It's really important that this is understood and people have an aligned understanding as well for everyone who's going to be involved in the process. And ultimately, you're welcoming a person into the team. It's not just a role, right? So there's also a lot of the human dynamics that you can really help with in the period. And for me, that starts before the start date. I think in tech roles at the moment, we're seeing notice periods go up and up and up and up. And I think that's a result of hiring's hard and people want to hang on to talent, so they've given themselves a good enough window to replace somebody if they do leave. So we're seeing things like 3 months is quite normal in a lot of senior engineering roles at the moment. So it can be a long time between when you're interviewing somebody and when you're talking about the role and getting all excited about them and the possibilities, and them actually starting in the business. So for me, that window is actually part of the onboarding. Stay in touch with the candidate, make sure you keep them up to date with any changes, especially, I mean, I work in a startup, right? And I'm sure a lot of people listening do. Things can change a lot, even in the space of a month, even if it's just a 4-week notice period. Like the role that you were talking about 4 weeks ago could change. And I think it's really important to bring the candidate on that journey. And then just on the more sort of on the social aspect, a lot of our roles do, really thrive when you've got really solid relationships with the person that you're working with. So inviting people to things like team socials or catching up for coffee with people they might be working with. If the candidate's up for that, I think that's a great thing to do before people start, so that it's not a big bang on their first day. They've got some familiar faces and some idea of what's going on. So that's before the start date. And then once somebody's actually in the room, I think it's really important to have a plan. So setting clear expectations, making sure they're introduced to the right people, making sure they've got access to everything they need, they're pointed in the right direction. Again, my experience is mostly in startups. There isn't the manual. The manual is knowing to go over here and read this and knowing where to access bits of documentation or who does what. And so making sure that's all clear and accessible to the person who's coming into the team is super important. And things like the 30, 60, 90-day plans are quite useful to set sort of markers in the sand of where we should have got to in those sort of three time brackets. So definitely have a plan. On the flip side, be ready for that plan to change. Because the things evolve. You might find that somebody races through something a bit quicker. You might find that a project slightly changed since you set the 90-day goals. So having a plan is really, really important, because it means that you've sat down, you've both engaged in what does success look like, but at the same time, you need to be ready to change it, because, being pragmatic, you should change your plans if the landscape is looking a bit different. And then the output for me of good onboarding is somebody who's happy and productive in the team. It's as simple as that, really. For the role and the skills, the knowledge, the capacity that you wanted to bring in, you're starting to realize the value of that. The team's getting settled into a dynamic, and the person is starting to really feel solid in their role. They know what's expected of them, and they know how to do their job. So yeah, for me, that's sort of the process and what you could expect to see at the end.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, definitely from understanding expectations, the concern always is, as a developer, you're applying for multiple roles. You saw the job description once. You have a 1 month hiring process, 3 month probation. After 4 months, you're not going to remember what you actually agreed to for what you've been hired with. So that does cover quite well. And actually, you just touched on there on successful onboarding and what that output look like. And one of the questions from the audience actually is, what do you measure or record to assess whether onboarding has actually been successful?
It's a very good question. I'd say that comes on a number of fronts. So some things are very functional. So say for a developer, it's, have they got their environment set up? Have they been able to successfully commit code? Are they starting to interact with all the tooling you've got, whatever it may be, and start to follow the processes? So there's some very tick box type exercises that you can probably put down, have they done these activities? Because if they've done them, they're probably well set up. The team relationships piece is actually a little bit harder. And what we like to do at Zego is actually to run 360 reviews towards the end of a probation period, just to get a read from the team on how they're feeling about the role. It's not necessarily a reflection, good or bad, on the candidate, but it's as managers, where do we have opportunities to maybe sort of help iron out any kinks that have emerged, or to better define things. So yeah, in terms of measurables, I would say the sort of functional list coupled with some more qualitative feedback from the person and the team that they're operating in as well, is what I'd be looking at.
So you don't look at the productivity or the deliverables of the team as a whole as part of a successful onboarding or not?
It depends what type of role they're going into. If the team has well-established metrics, is a well-formed team, and they are already measuring that, you would expect to see some change in that. However, I will say, for onboarding, especially engineers, there is a cost to the team that you're putting them into. So as you might, double the number of engineers in a team, but you wouldn't double the output for quite a long time. So I think in this sort of initial period of onboarding, I don't necessarily look at that, because I think there's a knock-on effect on the team that they're going into with the investment that they're putting in to the individual, and the individual has a lot to learn, presumably, in the teams, unless it's a very, very operational teams, maybe something like a sort of help desk type setup in which you would be onboarded quite quickly. But for developer roles, I tend to hold off on that until later down the line.
Excellent. I do see people falling into that path of productivity as their measure of success or not quite a lot. So yeah, I mean, and as you say, it's not a great assessment tool. As with just an internal hire or external hire, there's always going to be an onboarding time and ramping up process for that. And as you're talking about expectations, so clarifying expectations, you mentioned the 30, 60, 90-day plans. Is that all you look at, or are there other ways of also trying to make sure expectations are aligned for the new member starting?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a sort of huge space, right? And having the sort of enumerated plan is great, but ultimately, I mean, for me, this is a joint exercise. This isn't on day one, you get presented with the plan as written by the manager, and we'll see you at 30, 60, 90 days. This is, if you want real engagement and real buy-in from the candidate, you should write it with them. You should set aside time when somebody starts to sit, talk through the challenges, the tasks, what you're expecting, and come up with that joint view of the world, and ultimately what we are both expecting. I think it's worth noting here as well that candidates should have an expectation on the business as well. This isn't a one-way street, and there's a lot of things that they will need. So it's important that you capture that side as well. And for me, onboarding looks different for different roles as well. I think we sort of touched on it slightly before, but there are, for individual contributors, for engineers in a team, say, it can be quite functional, the expectations. So you might have things like, we have onboarding documentation that walks you through how to get your environment set up, what tooling we use, what accounts you're going to need. And that's just a very that is a tick box exercise, but it's important that it's there, and it's important that you direct people to it and make sure that that type of activity is done. And then also introductions with team members as well for individual contributors. For leaders, I think it's a little different. And when I say leaders, I mean managers in this respect, because I do believe that leadership is a core skill of individual contributors as well. But you might be handing over responsibilities, you might be handing over line management to new people. And that is a much more involved process. That's, introductions, that's spending time with everybody involved in that and making sure, because there isn't a one size fits all. And especially handing over of line management should be done really carefully with a lot of communication. And then we were talking about this before, where we cleared about onboarding as a CTO. And in my notes here, I've written all bets are off when you're onboarding as a CTO, because it is kind of your responsibility at that point to manage your onboarding and to make sure that you're building those relationships. Nobody's going to sort of present you with, here's the tick box of things that we expect from you in the first 30 days. But it's important actually that you almost jointly define that contract and you lead on that with the people around you, whether it's your direct reports, whether it's your peers in a leadership role. So yeah, very different lenses depending on the type of role. But I think one of the main threads for me is just communication. Like, there's a lot of people involved in onboarding any role, right through from junior engineers through to CTOs. And if you can keep the communication strong and keep that shared understanding of what we're doing and why during this period, that's a good rule of thumb for me.
Okay, great. So we've got two questions for the audience that, from the same member that's talking about automating the process. So both are sort of tied in together. So I'll get you to answer them both at the same time. What do you recommend automating as part of the onboarding process, especially for companies that are hiring large numbers of new engineers each year? And then the second question is, what should you not automate?
Well, that's a really, really good question. I'll start with the what not to automate. You can't automate the relationship building or any of the people aspect of these roles. Team dynamics are tricky. And I think if you tried to sort of apply a one process fits all approach to anything on that side, I think you're asking for trouble there. Like, people as individuals will have different journeys to embed themselves in a team. And I think you just that's where, as leaders, as managers, investing the effort is completely worth it. Things like, setting up environments, getting account logins, anything to do with the more sort of functional side, automate away. If you can have accounts ready set up for new joiners, there's a lot of tools now that enable you to sort of automate away things like this. Yeah, absolutely. Nobody needs to sit with somebody getting them, set up on Jira if you can automate that away. So I would, as a rule there, I would look at, is this something to do with people or team dynamics? Absolutely don't automate it. Is this a task that is repeatable? Yeah, automate away, and there's no risk. Nobody would need to do it differently, would be my rule for that one. It's a good question though, especially if you're onboarding large numbers, because it can, I think that the sort of implicit comment in that question is that it is so time consuming onboarding people into teams. So I think, if you can, lower that investment, it's definitely worth it.
Okay, great. And then another follow-up question from the audience member as well, actually, which is still relevant. How reusable or generic is your onboarding for technical staff versus the non-technical staff? Would you do some joint onboarding or would you keep them separate?
We do have a lot of overlap at Zego with technical and non-technical. So we have, we actually run in the first week, we have a standardized, it's like our HR onboarding process where everyone goes, learns about the business, what departments we have, who's running what, how we do things at Zego as a company, because it's easy when we're talking about engineering. Like, engineering culture is such a strong thing in teams, and it's something that we talk a lot about as an industry as well. but we can't ignore the fact that, we live as part of a company culture and there's a company way of doing things. So everybody goes through that initial HR onboarding, and then we have a sort of parallel tech onboarding piece for the more specific things as well. But I actually think it's really healthy that a whole company gets a standardized view of the world as they're coming in, because it puts everybody in a level playing field. And people as well, we found it quite powerful that you're part of an onboarding group. It's like, oh yeah, I was a new joiner with that person in marketing. And it helps form those relationships as well. So I absolutely wouldn't silo engineering onboarding at all. There are some, obviously, there's specific things that are quite obvious. I won't go into them, but yeah, as much as you can push up to the company level, I think it's really powerful.
Excellent. Okay, cool. So I've got a few more questions, but I'm going to keep on some of my list just to make some progress on that.
Questions are great. I love them.
Absolutely. We will be definitely coming back to them. So with dealing with stress, so being a new starter in an organization can be very stressful. How can managers support reducing the stress level for new members that have been onboarded?
This is something actually that's quite... I put a lot of emphasis on this for new starters, because changing jobs is really stressful for a lot of people. And I mean, in engineering, we see a lot of, especially in individual contributor roles, a lot of people who might be sort of quite introverted. And for them, I mean, I sort of put myself into this category to a certain extent. A whole day of meeting new people and having conversations and trying to load up and learn, and that is exhausting. It's really, really exhausting when your role might not look like that day to day. So I think, as managers and leaders, just being aware of that, just being aware that this person's coming into a completely new environment. They might have been incredibly comfortable in their old role. They knew everyone, they knew everything, and suddenly that entire safety net has gone. And that's hard. That is really hard on an individual. So, just checking in with people. How are you doing? Are you okay? And it's okay to feel stressed. It's okay to feel like this is a lot, because it is a lot. Changing jobs is a huge, huge event. Even in tech, where we see people move quite regularly, it doesn't make it any less stressful. So I think just being aware of that, and be aware that it's because we spend so many hours of our weeks working. It is a huge part of somebody's life. So the role that they're about to take is a big deal to them, even though you might have been at the company forever and this is just your day-to-day. This is big. So just make sure you've recognized that and be open about that. Have that conversation. I realize this might be stressful for you. How are you doing? And be ready to flex the plans, because if somebody is finding it overwhelming, stressful, it is far better to give them a bit of space and time. You want them in a good headspace when they're meeting key people, when they're learning things about the team. It's worth giving them a little bit of space to have that go smoothly than to have them stressed through the process. So yeah, I'm a big believer in keeping those open channels going and flexing your plans, because ultimately, yeah, you'll see the benefits later down the line.
Great. So filling their calendar full of meetings for their entire first 5 days of work isn't the best approach.
Maybe not unless you've jointly done that. I think sit down with the person and if they're like, yeah, just get it all in. I love meeting people. Fine. Let them get on with it, but just be cognizant that's not everybody's idea of a fun first week.
Sure. Okay. And then going through to the side, you're talking about obviously disruption to the team. What's the best way to communicate new hires into the businesses and other teams that are coming up?
Well, I think on this one, whatever we knew before, it all changed when we all started working remotely full time. I know some businesses have been doing this for years, but for a lot of us, the rules changed overnight. And we've hired a lot of people after we went remote. As a company, there's a lot of people in the team that I've never seen in person, which is a very new thing for us as a business. So I think here, communicating the new roles, you used to get away with, oh, we're hiring so-and-so, or, at a team meeting, you might introduce the role and make sure and maybe send an email. And then you parade the person around everybody's desk and everyone had laid eyes on them, they knew who they were. It's not as easy as that in a remote setting. So I think for the business, how to communicate it, what is this role? Why are we introducing it? Are two key pillars for me. Just making sure everybody, you don't need to send the full, pages and pages of job description. Just, we're opening this role. We've got a person coming in for it. This is why we need it. This is the person who's coming in, and why did we hire them? Why are we excited about this person? Most of the people we hire, you meet some incredible people in tech. And I mean, one of my favorite things is actually interviewing, because you get to know all sorts of different people, and the people that you hire, usually you're excited about them. Make sure you communicate that to the team. Make sure they know why you've hired them. And I think, especially talking, like going back to the sensitivities we were talking about earlier, you can sort of move past that quite quickly if you couch this in terms of, we're excited about this person, they're coming in to do this role, and this is what the team's going to gain from that. This is what you stand to gain, especially if you're bringing in quite senior roles. The line of, you're going to learn from this person. This person has this incredible experience, and you're going to work with them. Like that's really powerful for a team to understand why and what this role is coming in. And on the flip side, you also obviously need to communicate to the individual what and why they're here. And I think being open about how excited you are about them coming into the business is really important as well. What is it you've seen in them? Because then they know why. They've got a real grasp on what it is they're bringing to the table. And I think it gives them a lot more confidence when they're coming into the room. And also, just make sure you've communicated to them who they're working with, why the team's set up like this, what are we hoping to achieve? Obviously, it's not one conversation. You don't do this in one go, right? This is, you reiterate these things over a period of time, which I think that's another really important point. Like, just because you sent one email doesn't mean the team's got the message. So you need to make sure that you're talking to them, emailing them, you've mentioned it, and check in with them. It's quite an involved process to communicate these things, but it's a very, very good investment of time and effort, because you'll save so much drama down the line by getting on top of this quickly and getting everyone in a good headspace to welcome new people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've definitely come across times where we've hired like a senior member into the team, and they heard about the role was been hired for before even understanding why we were hiring for that role. And then you're having to firefight and at least explain why that role's been hired and what their job actually is going to be. Okay, so we can't talk about onboarding without actually touching on probation. So from your perspective, how should you handle the probation period, and what are you looking for?
It's interesting because it just occurred to me actually whilst we're talking about it. I consider onboarding to be the probation period, but I'd love to hear if any of the audience consider it to be different. But that's the sort of the crucial period is that probationary period. So it is really important. It's something that I think we'd all rather it wasn't a thing, but things go wrong in interviews, and somebody might come in who doesn't actually have the skills for the role or just isn't a good fit for the team. It really does happen, especially I think the question earlier about ramping up quickly. If you're moving at speed and you're scaling up rapidly, you need to build this into your processes. Probations are important in that setting. You will get it wrong, so make sure you've got the processes to handle it. And going back to the piece about being clear on expectations, that is where you'll give yourself the best idea about how somebody's performing in a role, because you've got something concrete to look at as well. So you'll get a really good read on whether somebody's underperforming by looking at what their output is against the expectations. And for probations, I mean, if there's a problem, you want to know quickly. You want to be able to know that this isn't working and act on it quickly, because as we talked about at the beginning, it could be hugely disruptive to a team if onboarding is going badly for any reason. And the cost of carrying somebody on a team, if the team's constantly trying to firefight and get somebody on board and it's just not happening, and they're not getting it, and they're not becoming productive, you're draining the existing team's time, and it's not a great experience for the new starter either. And then there's the sort of that's the sort of performance side. The flip side is if it's just not a good fit for whatever reason, the personalities in the team or the role wasn't, what we thought we understood, hasn't really, become apparent in that period of onboarding either. And I think the main piece for me in both those situations is to act decisively. Do you need to sort of have a difficult conversation and say, sorry, the skills just aren't there. We just don't see the performance that we need to see at this point. And I think acting decisively and acting early is it is a really good rule of thumb there, because the investment and the disruption otherwise can really affect your teams. If it's not a good fit, you can have a look, like, is there a different team? Is there a different role that you can get that person into as well? Like, is there something that might be a better fit for them, a better team? And being open and honest as well in both situations. I think, don't wait until the end of a probation period to tell somebody they're underperforming. I think that's one of the worst things you can do to somebody. If they think everything's been fine and they get a horrible shock at the end, having the open conversation, we're in the probation period, it lasts X weeks or months. This is how we think you're doing. This is what we need to see, and just checking in regularly so everyone's going on the same journey. Because if you flag it early, you might actually see a transformation in the candidate. If you sit on it and wait till the end to pull the trigger, you'll never know whether that person, maybe there might have been something that they just didn't understand, that they hadn't had access to. Something might have gone wrong on our side as well. Mistakes happen on both sides. So yeah, I think it is, sadly, it's one of those things that none of us really like, but it is a really, really critical part of the onboarding process.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely no employee wants to be an underperforming member of any team. And, maybe they come from a different working culture. As long as it's highlighted to them when they start and throughout their process, it gives them the ability to adapt. Obviously, technical strengths or knowledge should have been picked up in the interview stages. But if you're interviewing fast and hiring fast, you can't always identify potential problems with any candidate, can you? So there's always that risk there, which is why they exist to start with, isn't there? And
they might not like it as well. Like the candidate, it's a two-way, especially in technical roles, right? I think, it's a matter, it is a fact in this industry that people have options. Good engineers can pick up jobs anywhere they want to work. It's it's a buyer's market in that respect. And they're assessing you as a company as well. So having that openness and that transparency both ways, you will also save yourself a horrible shock at the end if they turn around and say, yeah, actually, whilst my notice period's a week, I'm off. Because if you think it's been going brilliantly and the team are really excited, you've invested loads of effort, that can be a horrible surprise at the end. So make sure that and it's hard, right? Because those types of conversations are, reliant on a lot of trust between the individuals, which is why if you can pack some of that relationship building into before the start date, you'll give yourself a much better ramp for these things as well.
Great. Okay. And also earlier on, you mentioned something about, the difference between individual contributor or leader, or the fact that leader is still an individual contributor. How does onboarding differ depending on the seniority or the leadership level of the role that you've just hired for?
For me, the rule is like the more senior, the less defined the onboarding generally is. If you're onboarding a sort of junior or mid-level engineer into the team, there is usually, there'll be the company onboarding piece, and then there'll be a checklist of like, get all this set up, and then there'll be, just getting into the team and starting to do the work. It's quite a known path, and there'll be responsibilities from the leaders in that space to make sure everyone's got what they need, that they're spending time with them, that they're teaching them, and this is the way we do things around here, and getting them into the swing of it. As you sort of go up the ranks, so to speak, I think it gets more and more bespoke depending on the role. And for an individual contributor, I think at a very senior level, sort of as an aside, we run the tracks in parallel at Zego. I think it's really important that you can be at the most senior level as an individual contributor. You don't have to go into people management. It's a different skill, it's a different role. So we run them as parallel tracks going up in seniority. But if you're onboarding a principal engineer, yes, there's the tick list of get yourself set up on these things and learning about how things are structured, but you're also trying to help that person get a handle on how are they going to take ownership, and how are they going to get themselves into a respected leading position in the team. And that'll be different depending on which bit of the company and which bit of the team and what responsibilities they're going to have. For managers, I think, as I said before, it is very involved because it's people. And there's no shortcut. It's not like, oh yeah, your manager was this person last week and now it's this new person. Enjoy. Like, there will be a prolonged period where there's handover and you're building trust, you're building relationships. So I think the seniority is how much responsibility there is on yourself to define, the ultimate being like this example I was talking about earlier with CTOs, where you really are leading the charge on your onboarding and making sure you're clear on what you need to know and where you need to dig into, and getting to know people across the business as well.
Okay, great. Yes, definitely. My next question is touching on the C-level onboarding process. So going into a C-level role, you often have to essentially onboard yourself, as you mentioned. I believe your story of joining Zego was a great example of this. Could you tell us a little bit about that story, please?
Yeah, I can do. I didn't join Zego as the CTO. I actually joined as head of engineering back in the day. It's coming up for, I think it's over a year and a half ago now. And when I joined, Stu Kelly was in position as the CTO, and done a great job of building out the team, building out the tech. He was part of the founding team. He was the technical co-founder of Zego. So obviously I had, sort of come into the room with an expectation that I'd have some, self managed part of the onboarding, but ultimately I had, somebody who would be sort of guiding that process. And Stu and I had a really, we'd had a sort of great, going back to the sort of, pre-start date, we'd had lunch a few times together. We'd sort of built a really good relationship before I got into the room, because we were going to be working so closely together, right? It's really important. And he sort of sat me down on my first day. It was like, I actually have decided that the CTO role isn't for me, and I'd much rather be sort of as part of the team, whatever that might look like. It wasn't sort of very clearly defined at the time, but he knew that sort of CTO managerial type role wasn't for him. And I will always admire the honesty in that conversation. I think it's one of the most inspiring things I've ever sort of witnessed in my career, is somebody saying, yeah, I've got this great big job title and it's not making me happy. I'd much rather be doing a different role. So very quickly, he sort of stepped out of the role, and then I ended up sort of taking on the team and managing that onboarding in a very different way, whilst he was also onboarding into a different role. So we had this interesting situation where both of us, like, he ended up onboarding into a principal engineer role and sort of, leading from the very, very top, the sort of technical direction and the development. And I was onboarding eventually into the CTO role simultaneously. So we were in this fascinating world of handovers, whilst both navigating that for ourselves and trying to sort of find our relationship in that as well, because it's not an easy time. And I think the thing that really worked in that time, as I said, we built some trust beforehand, so we could sort of lean on that. We were incredibly open with each other and incredibly honest. We gave each other a lot of support. We had, like, I think the rule at the time was like, in our respective areas, like we call the shots. So we don't try and influence each other in that way, and giving space when people needed it as well. I think one of the things that Stu did amazingly well in that period was actually take a step back. At the time, it was incredibly scary for me, but he did sort of take a step back and let me find my feet in the role as well. And I think if you've got any sort of handover situation, if you're the person handing over, I think the thing I learned from Stu in that situation is sometimes the best thing you can do is to sort of become a little bit more distant from the problems, and then step in where you think you can help, rather than being constantly present in the environment. So yeah, it was a really interesting few months whilst we both sort of found our feet with that. And I'm really happy to say it's worked out, and we've sort of maintained a great relationship through that, and it works really well. And we're both, we both got the roles that make us really happy and productive. So we've made that work. But one of I've sort of got some notes here on this bit, because I think there's so much in this story, but the main piece for me that made it a success, and I think this would go for any CTO onboarding as well, is accountability. So it is really, really vital. If you haven't got somebody who's, now do this is what we expect, like, you have to have yourself held to account by the team. And Stu did an incredible job of holding me to account on things. So, I was sort of running at things, and he'd be like, I don't agree with the way you're doing that, or I see a problem here, and I'm bringing, he built the team, he knew them inside out, so he was bringing his experience and holding me to account on the directions that I was taking, and it was incredibly valuable. But to be able to have those types of conversations, I think as a CTO, you need to be able to handle those conversations from the team. If you're coming into a new role, you need to welcome that feedback really positively, like thank people for their feedback. because you're taking on a team, presumably that's already running if you're going into a new CTO, unless you've built it yourself, there'll be a hell of a lot you don't know. And so establishing that space where people can have really open and honest conversations with you, it's hard because you'll sort of come in, you'll be like, right, we're going to do this. And then you'll sort of, have uproar. But if you can navigate that positively, that's one of the most vital things I think you can do. And the team as well have a responsibility to hold you to account. So that is one of the things that, I think we sort of learned in that period is it's actually really like accountability in that first period. If you're in any leadership position, it can really accelerate you becoming effective because you'll get an understanding of the teams. You might not always agree with what you're being held to account for, but it gives you real insight into how teams operate and what's important to them. So yeah, there you go. There's the story.
That's a great story. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely been in organizations where I've seen the CTO be moved down to a different role, either by choice or by force, because obviously they're not suited to the more people side of the role, and they're much more technically minded and prefer that type of area. So, having the self-awareness to make that choice yourself of what you want to do is great. And obviously having that type of experience where you weren't expecting the CTO role and suddenly this is now yours, that is a great shock to your first day at work, definitely. Okay then, so obviously with the times that we've been living at the moment, remote obviously comes up one question already from the audience and obviously one from me. So to start off with my remote question, how does onboarding differ when you are dealing with remote or distributed teams?
This is for me a bit of a everything and nothing question. Everything's different and nothing's different. So it's obviously more challenging because communication is more challenging in distributed teams that maybe haven't been distributed from day one. I think it depends on your organization, but I think a lot of organizations are sort of staring down the barrel of having switched very quickly to a method of work that wasn't part of their DNA. And I think it's fair to say that across the board, businesses are finding that challenging from a communication point of view because they're just not used to communicating in this type of environment. So I think if we're taking the example of teams that maybe would have been used to onboarding in person, I think it's the personal relationships piece that really, that is a lot different, and people's understanding of the business as a whole. So, if you're in person, you're in the office, you can see the finance department over there. You can see the marketing team. You sort of get a sense, even if you don't know these people and you don't work with them, you'd have no reason to go and sit in a meeting with them. You get that tacit knowledge from being around them. And that is incredibly difficult to replicate. If anybody has managed to replicate that, I'd love to hear about it because short of just introducing people for endless Zoom calls, it's hard to get that same level of integratedness within the team. So I guess the sort of people dynamics are the biggest difference for me. And to overcome that, I think it is making sure that you've got introductions set up, that something as simple as having an org chart for the company that people can just go and reference. One of the things I've actually found, I don't know if this is just me or whether this is a thing, I haven't looked into this, but I find it harder to remember people's names when I've only met them on Zoom. So I find myself looking at, we've told people now, put your job titles in Slack so that somebody can find you and remember what your name is and have a photo of you in Slack as well. Because I find myself referencing that so much more than when I was in the office. And maybe it's because the team's grown. Maybe this is sort of, it's a very unscientific observation that I'm making. But I think, making sure that you've got the resources that people can go and look things up and understand how it works, and encourage people to use them, especially juniors. One of my biggest concerns, I think, from this whole remote working piece is that juniors aren't getting the same experience of starting in a team and getting to know people, because they'll only sit in the meetings they're in and talk to the people that they're working directly with. They don't get that whole company experience that you get in an office unless you actively create it for them. So if you are going to push out assets and things that educate people about your company, make sure people are actually using them, because juniors might not think to reference that and put themselves out there.
Sure. Just on your point of remembering names, first day in the office, you meet everyone in the office and you can't remember a single person's name
Oh,
at
no
the end
chance.
of that. So yeah, obviously, organizational wiki, or at least organizational structure, is very, very useful. So carrying on one of the audience questions, essentially, is there any lessons learned during onboarding with this in this remote way that you'll like to carry through once the rules relax and maybe people are on site more?
I would say our onboarding process, and it's on two levels actually, because we've scaled quite substantially as a company through this period as well. So I think there would have been a little bit of this, but I think being distributed has accelerated it. Is things like our documentation and having standardized plans and, more sort of known structures, whereas before, one of the things we're about to do actually for new starters is, host weekly, fortnightly, whatever it will end up being, meet and greets with engineering leadership for new engineers, so myself or the director of engineering, just to sit down with all new starters so they have a chance to sort of see who we are. Because in the office, somebody would have been brought over to somebody's desk, or I have caught somebody in the kitchen, and it'd be very informal. Whereas we've put more formal processes in, and now we're continuing to do so. And I think even if we went back to in the office, I think having those dedicated pieces of time is something that I would definitely keep, because in the conversations I've had with new starters, it is invaluable as well to get people's insights about the company, and just put faces to names and know who the team are. So that's something I would definitely keep.
Okay, great. So the next audience question is from Sean King, who I think you know. What would you change in your process today?
What would I change in my process today? I'm tempted to bat this one straight back. Sean's the director of engineering at Zego, for anybody else listening. What would we change about the process today? I mean, these processes are always in evolution. There's always things to change. That is one thing I will say. Actually, I don't think I've made that point yet. Like, never call your onboarding process done. Like, never ever. Like, say, it is here, we've written it down, we are done with onboarding. Because if your team's changing, if your team's growing, even if it's not, right, you can always improve. So treating this thing as a living, breathing, emerging and evolving process, I think, is really, really healthy. In terms of specifics, I would definitely tighten up, I think, access to key people in the engineering team. So I think people do meet tech leads, principal engineers, me, Sean, but I think having a more standardized view of that for people, because it's a little bit hit and miss at the moment as to who people meet when they come in. And I think that's one of the things that we could do a lot better, is to make ourselves more available as leaders to new starters.
Okay, great. All right then. So one of the other questions from the audience then, for fast moving companies and industries, do you think companies should invest in re-onboarding?
Oh, this is a really interesting one. I'm going to say yes, because especially for people who join very early stage in a startup, it's a completely different company. Like the company that I work for today, Zego, it will be a different company in 12 months' time. My role will be different. People will be doing different roles. And yeah, this is a fascinating question. I love this question because it's actually quite hard for teams to navigate this, especially, ambitious young people, want to know where their next promotion is coming from. And sometimes the honest answer to that question is like, look, this company is growing so quickly. If you have retained the title of X, whatever it might be, in a year's time, that role will be so much more responsibility than you have today. And we found as well that the company onboarding process, because we have invested a lot into it as a company, is there are great assets that are shared through that. There's great information, and it does occur to us occasionally. It's like, do our current employees know this stuff? Because that changed 6 months ago, and actually we didn't have that department 3 months ago. And the company does look very different. And especially I think if you're in sort of one team and you've been in there for quite a while, you might not, especially in a distributed environment, you might have not seen what's going on. So it's not something that we formally do at the moment, but I would absolutely say yes, re-onboard people, especially if your company's changing. quickly, which a lot of startups and scale-ups are.
It's a great idea. I've never thought of that myself, but
that's awesome.
That would be great to do. Okay, then. So just going back to your experience as a CTO for when you were getting onboarded. So one from the audience again, if there is one thing you wish you had, or actually that you valued as part of your own onboarding as a CTO, what would it be?
One of the pieces of advice that I got when I was onboarding, albeit obviously everything was sort of a bit chaotic in my onboarding with the changing roles and whatnot, but somebody sort of sat me down and said, there's a lot of things that you can fix in this period if they go wrong. One of the things that you can't fix are the relationships, and especially your relationship with the CEO. And two incredibly busy roles, finding the time to sort of invest in that was tricky, but I think it was a really powerful piece of advice, making sure that we had a way to communicate with each other, making sure that we understood each other, and that I'd understood what was, what he wanted from the business ultimately, because I'm responsible for making sure that we deliver on that. So there was a lot of things that I consciously didn't invest in as a sort of expense for over-investing in the relationships at that senior level. And for me, that was a really powerful piece of advice. And in terms of one thing, I suppose the things I'd wish that I'd had, is one of the things that I guess I'm still sort of working on me as a CTO, is that sort of wider business knowledge and awareness. But the company onboarding didn't really exist in the same way that it does today when I started. And I think there were things that I learned a few months down the line that should have been really obvious to me. This is partly on me as well, but I think just having those assets to see like, no, this is what this means, especially I think for a lot of technologists, we enter industries that we might not know. I mean, I hadn't worked in insurance before I worked at Zego. I had an awful lot to learn. So anything that can help you get up to speed on the industry that you're working in as well. I'd say I sort of wish I'd spent a bit more time on that in the beginning, because there were some pretty embarrassing moments later on as a result of me not doing that.
Yeah, I'd say most startups that I go into, whether a leadership or CTO role, there's no onboarding process at all. So, that's what we're here for, isn't it?
Yeah.
So another question from the audience is, do you use tools like pulse checks to assess whether large groups of new starters are happy? Do you find such pulse tools counterproductive or obviously a benefit?
We use things like Peakon generally across the company, and we segment by new starters, so we can see as a cohort, how new joiners are feeling. I will say tools like that, especially if it's a positive sort of experience, if you've got the role nailed down and things are sort of generally going well, new starters will be a lot happier generally on a scale. They're excited to be here. It's a fresh start. They've got a new role and everything's looking great. So I find that those tools can sometimes skew to the positive end, which can sometimes lull you into a false sense of security. So I think those tools, they can be useful, but ultimately you should know via the conversations that you're having with new starters if there's a problem. I don't think you should need those tools to necessarily inform you, but they can be quite, if you're looking at cohorts, then they're useful.
So obviously, depending on the size of the team, if your team is manageable where you can know each individual, then that's great. Obviously, if you can't, you're dependent on the middle layer of management to be able to identify that and highlight those issues.
100%.
Okay, cool. Okay, so dealing with expectations piece then, should you use tools like RACI, the responsible, accountable, consulted or informed matrix to be able to clarify responsibilities, or is that not normally suitable?
I think those tools, they can be incredibly powerful. I will say if you only do them for new roles, it can be quite confusing. So I wouldn't deploy things like that just in the context of onboarding. But if the team is used to using things like that, if they know where their responsibilities and accountability, etc., lie within the team, absolutely. Put something together for new starters as well, because that's part of how the team understands their ways of working with each other. But I wouldn't sort of deploy that in isolation, because if one person has that very tightly defined and the rest of the team don't, it can get very confusing quite quickly.
Okay, and then dealing with about team dynamics. Obviously, if you're adding one or multiple members to a new team, how do you normally see the dynamics change, and what do you normally look out for to try and avoid issues?
Well, I think the first thing is acknowledging that the team dynamics will change. That's just a fact, right? We're working with human beings, and humans bring all sorts of like weird and wonderful things to the table, especially when they work in combination with each other. So I think be ready that the team especially if it's been a sort of well-established team that's been working together for a while, prepare them for the fact that introducing a new member is a change, and it's not a negative thing. It's a positive thing. It's part of the team evolving, but give it space and time, and give it the recognition that this is a change for the team. And yeah, I suppose to avoid the sort of negative dynamics, again, it's equipping the team with the right channels for feedback and encouraging them in open and transparent, curious conversations with each other. I think it's a period where a team need to almost overinvest in that sort of reflective and questioning nature of things. Like, so if somebody comes in and says, well, why are you doing it like that? Like, that makes no sense to me. There's sort of one reaction of teams being like, this is how we've always done it. Like, it works, like, go away. Or the sort of the thing that you should be encouraging your teams to do is to use that person's fresh pair of eyes on things. Because I know there are things, we've recently onboarded a chief product officer into Zego. And one of the things that I'm really enjoying is things that I'd just been doing. He sort of looked at them and said like, well, why is it like that? I was like, well, I've never really considered that, but you're absolutely right. Like, that absolutely makes no sense. And that's there's real value in using new people like that, but you need to get the team into the right mindset so they don't go defensive with that. And that's all about teaching them how to have constructive conversations and how to give feedback, how to take feedback well, as well, because that is a skill for teams. So I would say it's all about the way that people approach it, and prepping the team for that is important.
Wonderful then. And then the very last question from the audience and from me as well, is there a way for you to be able to summarize the plans or procedures for successfully onboarding for startup companies especially?
That's a big question. Right. So we've talked about onboarding starting before the start date. So I'd say make sure you've got open lines of communication to the person coming in. Make sure that both the business, the team, and the individual understand what role they're coming into, why they're coming into it, and why we're all excited about this. Get everybody on the positive front foot before that start date and start building those relationships as quickly as you can. Obviously, the candidate's time is precious. Don't try and sort of shoehorn them into all sorts, but be respectful, but do sort of push for some interaction during that time. When they get there, jointly invest in what success looks like for them and for their role. It's really important that they're bought into the plan as much as you are and as much as the team are. So make sure that you set aside time to jointly define what the next period's going to look like. Make sure you're clear about how long that period is. If it's a probation, make sure that they know the probation lasts for this long and this is what we're expecting. And then from there, I would say, there's the functional things as well. Make sure they're signed up to go to all the right introductory talks. They've got all the assets they need. And from that point onwards, I think anybody who's managing an onboarding process, your job is communication at that point. Communication with the individual, with the team. Be ready to flex, be ready to change things. And yeah, make sure that you're having open, transparent conversations. And I think if you've done onboarding right, it's a no surprises type situation. If you can sort of minimize the number of surprises for all sides during that time, you're doing something right.
Excellent. So there's an hour just flown by. It's been an excellent conversation. Thank you for talking with us today, Vicky. You can connect with Vicky after the event on her LinkedIn link, which I've just shared in the chat now, if you want to connect with her directly. Also next Friday, we have another CTO Craft Bytes event labeled Let It Go, How to Delegate Effectively. So do check us out again next week. So yeah, thank you again, Vicky. It's been great to have you here, and thank you to the audience for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.